She spent 10 years erasing herself, and he saw through every single layer in under 60 seconds. This is the story of Ariana Vale, a woman who lost everything to a lie, buried herself so deep even she forgot who she used to be. And Lorenzo DeLuca, the most feared man in Chicago, who looked at a quiet analyst hiding in the back corner of a room full of desperate people trying to impress him and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Curiosity. Then something far more dangerous. Stay until the end. You won't see the ending coming. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Up. The morning they announced the acquisition, Ariana Vale arrived at work 17 minutes early, the same as every other morning for the past 4 years, slipped through the side entrance on Wacker Drive before the lobby filled up, and took the stairs to the 14th floor because the elevator made her feel trapped. She was good at not being noticed. The gray cardigan she wore was 2 sizes too large. She'd bought it deliberately. The way it hung off her shoulders and swallowed her collarbone was the point. Her hair went into a knot before she left her apartment, and her glasses, plain rectangular frames with clear lenses she didn't need, sat low on her nose like a prop from a bad costume department. She carried a laptop bag that was scuffed at the corners and a coffee thermos that said nothing about her. Nothing about her said anything about her. That was the whole architecture of her life. She sat at her desk in the far corner of the open floor plan at Meridian Capital Group, a mid-sized investment advisory firm with about 200 employees across 2 floors, a forgettable logo, and a CFO who still didn't know her name after 4 years. She didn't correct that. She liked it. She opened her laptop, pulled up the overnight market data, and started working. At 8:47 a.m., her colleague Derek Finn dropped into the chair at the neighboring desk and swiveled to face her with the barely contained energy of someone who had been waiting to deliver news since approximately 6 a.m. "You hear?" he said. "Hear what?" "The company got bought." Ariana kept her eyes on her screen. Not like bought, like acquired, quietly. Nobody was supposed to know until this morning, but Melissa from HR apparently told someone in accounting last night, and now everyone knows. Derek paused, waiting for a reaction. He got nothing. "It's a private equity situation, supposedly. Some holding company out of..." "Derek." "Yeah. I have a 9 o'clock deadline." He swiveled back to his own desk, but he wasn't done. "The new owner is coming in personally. Today. Like today. They're calling an all-hands for 11. Even the analysts." He added that last part like it was strange, because it was. All-hands meetings at Meridian never included people below senior associate level. The analysts existed in a kind of benign institutional invisibility, doing the work that went upstairs under someone else's name. Ariana pulled up the third-quarter yield projection she'd been reconstructing from a corrupted dataset and started rebuilding the model by hand. Her fingers moved fast. She had the kind of precision that came from years of choosing work over everything else, over conversation, over relationships, over the slow, careful business of having a life. "I'm just saying," Derek tried one more time. "Apparently this guy is serious. Like serious. People are freaking out upstairs." She glanced at him once over the tops of her glasses. "People upstairs freak out when the coffee machine breaks." He laughed. She didn't, but not because it wasn't a little funny. At 10:58 a.m., she saved her work, closed the unnecessary tabs on her browser, and walked to the large conference room on the 14th floor with the rest of the analyst pool. 11 people, most of them in their late 20s, most of them visibly anxious in the way people got when something disrupted the predictable shape of their professional lives. Ariana found a spot near the back wall, away from the cluster of seats that formed around the table. She stood. She was better standing. It left a cleaner exit path, the room filled with people she recognized and people she didn't. Several senior directors she'd seen in passing. The CFO. The COO. A woman from legal whose name she'd never learned. Everyone had that particular brand of managed fear that came with uncertainty. Straightened postures, careful expressions, a studied casualness that wasn't casual at all. The room went quiet before she understood why. He walked in at exactly 11:03. She would think about that later, the exactness of it. Not 11 o'clock, which would have been a power move of the obvious kind. Not 11:05 or 11:10, which would have been the casual dismissiveness of someone who wanted you to know your time meant less than his. 11:03. Like he'd calculated the specific minute at which arriving would communicate the most without announcing it. Lorenzo De Luca was taller than she'd expected from the brief and deliberately vague information the morning's emails had contained. He wore a dark suit without a tie, which on another man might have read as approachable, but on him read as a choice made by someone who had stopped performing accessibility somewhere around his mid-30s and didn't miss it. He had a hard face, not ugly, not classically handsome in the polished magazine sense, but the kind of face that had been tested by things most faces never got close to. There was a stillness to how he moved through the room that she recognized, not from anyone in her current life, but from some older and more dangerous part of her memory that she kept carefully locked. He moved like a man who had never once needed to announce himself. Two men came in behind him. They stood near the door without sitting down, without speaking, without needing to explain what they were. Lorenzo De Luca stood at the head of the table and looked at the room. He didn't smile. He didn't do the thing executives usually did in these situations, which was deploy a kind of performed warmth designed to manage anxiety and manufacture goodwill. He simply looked at everyone, slowly, in a way that covered the room completely. And when his eyes reached the back wall where Ariana was standing, they stopped. For perhaps 3 seconds, she held herself very still, the way she'd learned to hold herself still in situations that required not attracting more attention than she'd already accidentally attracted. She made her face neutral. She breathed slowly. His gaze moved on. "I'll keep this short," he said. His voice was low and even, with a slight roughness to it that wasn't performed. Meridian Capital Group is now a subsidiary of De Luca Holdings. That transition is already complete. Nothing about your day-to-day function changes until I decide it changes. If your work is good, you'll know it. If it isn't, you'll also know it. He paused. Questions can go through your department heads. I'm not interested in questions today. He left before the nervous applause finished. The room immediately detonated into the kind of whispered conversation that fills spaces when an unpredictable thing has just happened. People turned to each other. Someone said the name again. De Luca, in the specific tone people used when a name carried weight they hadn't fully processed. Derek materialized at her elbow. "That's him," he said. "That's the guy." I gathered. He barely said anything. He said exactly what he wanted to say. Derek looked at her. "You know who he is? Like, actually, who he is?" She picked up her laptop bag from the floor where she'd set it. "I know enough." She knew more than enough. The name Lorenzo De Luca existed in certain financial circles the way a particular kind of weather existed. You didn't always see it directly, but you felt the pressure change before it arrived. His legitimate business holdings were substantial and well documented. De Luca Hotels, a shipping and logistics company called Meridian Maritime, a real estate development arm that had quietly reshaped 4 city blocks of Chicago's near north side in the past decade. What sat beneath that clean surface was the kind of open secret that people in the right rooms understood and in the wrong rooms didn't ask about. She had spent 4 years building a life specifically designed to keep her out of rooms where dangerous men paid attention to her. She went back to her desk and spent the rest of the afternoon finishing her yield projections. She did not think about the 3 seconds. She almost convinced herself of that. The summons came on a Thursday, 8 days after the acquisition announcement. It arrived as an email from an address she didn't recognize. Not through any internal HR system, not forwarded by her department head, but sent directly to her work account by someone named C. Reeves, identified only as Executive Office, De Luca Holdings. The language was brief to the point of curtness. "Ms. Vale, please report to the Executive Suite, 32nd floor, at 2:15 p.m. this afternoon." No subject line, no explanation. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to her department head, Marcus Chen, with a 2-word message. "Aware of this?" His response came back in 4 minutes. "Just got copied. No idea what it's about." "You okay?" She typed, "Fine. Sent it." Sat with the particular quality of stillness she maintained when something required managing from the inside rather than the outside. There were obvious explanations. A new owner conducting reviews. A restructuring that required talking to people at every level. A routine performance conversation. There was nothing specifically alarming about an executive wanting to meet with an analyst at a newly acquired company. Nothing. She spent the remaining 2 hours finishing 3 separate reports, eating half a sandwich at her desk, and not thinking about it with a discipline that cost her more than it should have. At 2:12, she took the elevator to 32. The executive suite at Meridian had been renovated recently enough that it still carried the particular smell of new carpet and ambition. The receptionist, young, alert in the specific way of people whose job required reading rooms quickly, directed her to a seating area and told her someone would be with her shortly. C. Reeves appeared instead, a woman in her early 40s with close-cropped hair and the expressionless efficiency of someone who managed everything and explained nothing. Mr. DeLuca will see you now. The office was larger than she expected. It occupied a corner of the floor-to-ceiling glass on two sides. The city stretched below in the particular afternoon light of a Chicago October that made everything look a little colder and a little more honest than it actually was. The furniture was clean-lined and dark. There were no personal objects on the desk, no photographs, no awards arranged for viewing, just a laptop, two phones, a single file folder, and a glass of water. Lorenzo DeLuca was standing at the window when she entered. He turned when he heard the door, moved to his desk, and sat without the kind of performative settling in that people used to signal you were expected to wait for them. He just sat. He didn't tell her to sit. There was a chair. She sat in it. He opened the file folder. She watched him read for approximately 30 seconds without speaking. She had the strong impression he already knew whatever was in it, that this was something else. Ariana Vale, he said. Not a question. Yes. 4 years at Meridian. Before that, 18 months at Callaway Investment Partners. He turned a page. Before that, 2 years at Harrington Group. He looked up. Before Harrington, nothing. You graduated top of your class from Northwestern with a double major in finance and applied mathematics. Then a gap. Then Harrington. The silence he left was the specific kind that expected to be filled. She did not fill it. Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite respect. It was closer to recalibration, the expression of someone who had expected a certain response and received a different one and was adjusting their assessment accordingly. Your reports, he said, are the best analytical work I've seen from this firm, by a significant margin. Thank you. That's not a compliment. That's an observation. He closed the folder. What I can't figure out is why someone with your capability is sitting in the back corner of a floor full of people half as competent, doing work that gets submitted under other people's names. The room felt very quiet. She kept her voice level. That's how the workflow is structured. I know how it's structured. I'm asking why you're comfortable with it. I'm not sure comfort is the relevant metric. What is the relevant metric? Doing the work well. He looked at her for a moment in a way that wasn't aggressive, but wasn't comfortable either. The kind of look that stripped the surface off things and sat with what was underneath. She held it. She'd had practice. I want to restructure the analytical division, he said. Create a dedicated strategic analysis unit reporting directly to the executive level. I want someone to head it. He paused. I want that to be you. The thing that moved through her chest was not excitement. She knew the shape of excitement. This was something adjacent to fear, the precise sensation of a door opening that she had spent years making sure stayed closed. I'm not the right person for that role, she said. Why? I work better in support positions. I don't. That's not a reason. That's a description. Mr. DeLuca, the role comes with full authority over the division, direct access to my office, compensation that reflects what your work is actually worth instead of what a mid-level budget allocated for an analyst position. He said it without selling it, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd tried to persuade her. I'm not asking you to be comfortable. I'm asking you if you can do the job. I'm saying I don't want the job. The silence that followed was not hostile. It was watchful. Okay, he said. And then, why? She stood. I appreciate the consideration. I'd like to continue in my current position. Sit down. The command was quiet, not sharp, not threatening. Just absolute in the particular way of a person who had never needed to raise his voice to make something clear. She sat. She didn't understand why she sat. She understood it completely. He leaned forward slightly. Something happened to you, he said. Not with curiosity, with certainty, the way a person stated something they'd already calculated. Before Harrington, whatever that gap is. The back of her neck went cold. My employment history is none of your... You're right, he said. It's not. He held her eyes. But I'm going to find out anyway. I'm telling you that directly because I think you're someone who would rather know what's coming than be surprised by it. She stood again. The offer remains open, he said. Take a week. She left without answering. Her footsteps were steady and measured down the hallway to the elevator, and she pressed the button and stood with her back to the wall and waited. And when the doors opened, she stepped inside and faced forward and waited for them to close. And it was only when the elevator was moving and she was alone in it that she let herself close her eyes for 3 seconds. 3 seconds. Then she opened them. Then she straightened her cardigan. The gap in her resume was a grave she'd dug herself, and she'd been tending it for a decade. Before Northwestern and the perfect GPA and the careful architecture of a professional life built to be useful and invisible, there had been a different Ariana Vale. One who wore fitted clothes and laughed in rooms full of people and understood, with the particular confidence of someone who had worked for everything they had and knew exactly what it was worth, that she was exceptional, that she was going to build something real. Before that, there had been Damien Ashcroft. She didn't let herself think the name often. She had trained herself out of it the way you trained yourself out of any habit that caused damage, through repetition, through replacement, through the slow accumulation of distance until the name sat in the far back of her memory like an object in a drawer she'd locked and lost the key to on purpose. Damien Ashcroft, whose family had been one of the oldest and most entrenched in Chicago's private wealth architecture, whose mother had looked at Ariana at the first dinner she'd attended as Damien's girlfriend with the specific expression of a woman who had already decided and was simply waiting for the opportunity, whose charm had felt, in the beginning, like being chosen. Really chosen, not for what you could do or what you were worth, but for what you were. She had been 24 years old and completely in love and completely unprepared for what love in a world like his actually cost. She'd been 6 weeks from the engagement party, an event that, in retrospect, had been less about them and more about the formal absorption of her into a social structure that had its own rules and its own gravity. When the photographs appeared, she still thought of them as photographs, though they were digital, because the word photographs was more clinical, more distant, less like what they had actually been. Images of her, intimate in a way that required violation to create, distributed to exactly the people who could do the most damage. Her future employer, who had already made a conditional offer. The partner at the firm where Damien's father served on the board. 3 members of Chicago's financial press. The images weren't real. She'd known that immediately. The way you knew the temperature of a room or the expression on a face, a knowledge that didn't require analysis because it was direct and physical. She'd never taken those photographs. She'd never been in those situations. The fabrication had been expert enough that her denials landed as exactly what denials from someone guilty and caught always land as. Damien had believed her for 4 days. On the 5th day, his mother had called her directly, in the tone of a woman who had decided to be generous about an unpleasant necessity, and told her that the engagement was over, that the Ashcroft family wished her well, and that any further attempt to contact Damien or contest the situation publicly would result in the distribution of additional materials. There had been additional materials. She had not contested it publicly. She had sat in the apartment she'd been 2 weeks from giving up to move into Damien's townhouse, and she had understood something that she had never quite been able to ununderstand since. That the world she'd been invited into had never actually opened its doors. She'd been standing on a welcome mat that could be pulled at any moment, and when it was pulled, not a single person she'd thought was in her corner had stayed in it. Not Damien, not the colleagues who'd known her for 3 years, not the firm that had made the conditional offer and now made its withdrawal with a form email. She'd spent 6 months barely functional, then 12 months rebuilding from scratch, then all the years since constructing the specific kind of life that couldn't be taken away because it didn't have enough surface area to attack. No prominence, no exposure, no standing in front of rooms, no letting anyone see her clearly enough to decide they didn't want what they saw. She hadn't realized until Lorenzo DeLuca had looked at her across a desk and said the word gap that she had been waiting all this time for someone to find the thing she was hiding. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the dark of her apartment on the 14th floor of a building she'd chosen specifically because it had 2 fire exits and a lobby doorman who knew her face. And she thought about the conversation with the specific grinding quality of a mind that couldn't stop processing what it wanted most to leave alone. He was going to look. He'd said so directly. She believed him, not because she thought he was trying to frighten her, but because she thought he was someone who said exactly what he meant. And what he meant was that he already had the tools and the inclination, and the only variable was time. The question was what happened when he found it. The answer, in every prior version of this scenario she'd run in the long years since, was the same. Exposure meant the loss of the carefully maintained professional neutrality that kept her employed and uncomplicated. It meant questions. It meant the particular look on people's faces when they encountered the story, that flicker of uncertainty that wasn't quite belief and wasn't quite disbelief, but was something worse, a held-in reserve of judgment that could tip either way depending on how you carried yourself about it. She was 34 years old and she was still afraid of that look. She hated knowing that. At 3:20 a.m., she got up, made tea she didn't particularly want, and sat at her kitchen table with the report she'd brought home and worked until 5:45, when the light changed outside the window and the city started making the sounds that meant the day was beginning again. And she showered and dressed and went through the precise routine of becoming someone who could move through the world unnoticed, and took the stairs and pushed through the side door on Wacker and went to her desk. The email was already waiting. From C. Reeves, Executive Office, Ms. Vale. Mr. DeLuca has asked me to let you know that the offer discussed yesterday has been extended to 2 weeks, at your request. She had not made any such request. She had refused the offer and left the building. She read it twice. Then she looked at the small potted plant on the corner of her desk, a succulent Derek had given her for her work anniversary 2 years ago, which she'd kept alive through what felt like sheer stubbornness more than care. And she thought about a man who looked at a room full of people trying to be noticed and chose to look at the one who was trying not to be. She thought about the word gap, and the word anyway, and the word open. She thought about 10 years. She typed back, understood. That was all. It was enough. Marcus Chen knocked on the side of her cubicle wall at 10:15 that morning, with the expression of a man who was trying to be casual and wasn't quite pulling it off. Hey, he said. Hey. So, he sat on the edge of Derek's chair, which Derek wasn't in. Heard you had a meeting upstairs. I did. Everything okay? She looked at him over her glasses. Marcus Chen was 41, decent at his job, and had spent 4 years being precisely as good a manager to her as the situation required. No more, no less. He'd submitted her work under the team's name without malice, because that was how the structure worked, and she'd never corrected it, because the structure working that way suited her. There was nothing unkind between them. There was also very little that was real. He offered me the strategic analysis head role, she said. I told him I wasn't interested. Marcus blinked. Wait, DeLuca offered you directly? Yes. Why would he? He stopped himself, rearranged. I mean, why did you turn it down? I told him I preferred my current position. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a person processing an implication they hadn't expected. She watched him work through it. The realization that the work he'd been claiming as team output for 4 years had apparently been visible enough to the right person to generate a direct offer to the person actually doing it. She watched him decide whether to be embarrassed by that or not. He landed somewhere between, look, he said, keeping his voice low. If there's something about the role that feels, I don't know, I'm fine, Marcus. Because if it's a question of support or resources, I'm fine. He nodded, a little uncertain, a little relieved to be able to stop pressing. Okay, well, let me know if anything changes. She nodded and turned back to her screen. He didn't move immediately. For what it's worth, he said quietly enough that it felt almost like he meant it. Your work it's really good. I know the structure doesn't always reflect that, but... She waited. But it's really good, he said. She felt something that she didn't want to feel. A small, unwanted warmth, the specific vulnerability of being seen by someone who hadn't been looking and wasn't sure what to do with what they'd found. Thank you, she said. He left. She stared at the yield model on her screen for a moment before she could see it again. The investigator's name was Ray Kessler, And he'd been working for Lorenzo De Luca for 11 years, first as a security consultant, and then in a capacity that had no clean title because clean titles didn't accommodate the actual scope of what he did. He was 63, ex-military, ex-federal, and had the specific patience of a man who had learned long ago that most answers weren't hidden so much as waiting to be asked about properly. Lorenzo had given him the name Ariana Vale and 3 instructions. Find the gap, find what's in it, and don't touch it until I've seen the full picture. Kessler had spent 17 years doing exactly this kind of work, and he rarely felt the particular quality of unease that crept into him 2 days into the Vale file. Not because the information was hard to find, it wasn't really once you knew where to look, but because of what it looked like when it came together. He laid it out on the conference table in Lorenzo's private office on the 35th floor of the De Luca Holdings Tower on a Friday afternoon in the 3rd week of October, 2 weeks after the acquisition. And he walked through it methodically, the way he always did, because his job wasn't to editorialize, and he was good at his job. He told Lorenzo about the Ashcroft family, about the photographs, about the campaign that had run through the social and financial architecture of a specific stratum of Chicago society with the precision of something that had been planned by people who understood exactly what they were destroying and had chosen to destroy it anyway. He showed him the metadata analysis on the original image files, the kind of forensic footprint that a proper investigation could have found in 2014 and hadn't been asked to look for because nobody with the resources to look had been motivated to do so. He showed him the legal correspondence, the letters from the Ashcroft family's attorney to the firm that had rescinded her employment offer, the careful language that hadn't quite been a threat and hadn't needed to be. He showed him the name of the man who had commissioned the fabrication. It wasn't Damien Ashcroft. Lorenzo sat with that for a moment. The brother, Kessler said. Why? Best I can reconstruct, Damien was going to go through with the marriage regardless of his mother's objections. The brother, Elliot, had a different calculation. Their father was in poor health. Estate planning, the presence of a wife from outside the family's circle of trust complicated certain arrangements. So he manufactured a scandal to end the engagement and paid for the image fabrication, used a contact through a private security firm that doesn't exist anymore. Kessler paused. She didn't know any of this. She walked away thinking she'd been destroyed by the weight of her own reputation and a family that didn't want her. She didn't know it was targeted. She didn't know there was a specific architecture behind it. Lorenzo was quiet for a long moment. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in late October, going gray and cold and honest about what it was under the polish. She's been hiding for 10 years, Lorenzo said. It wasn't quite a question. From what I can see, yes. Because she thought she deserved to. Kessler didn't answer that. It wasn't really his department. Lorenzo stood and walked to the window. He stood there for a while with his hands in his pockets and the particular stillness of a man who was running calculations that weren't about numbers. The brother, he said finally. Elliot Ashcroft. Where is he now? Still in Chicago, runs the family office since the father passed. Find me everything. Kessler gathered his materials. At the door, he paused. There's one more thing. Lorenzo waited. The anonymous message you received about her. The one flagging her old scandal. It came from an IP address associated with a private communications firm used by the Ashcroft family office. The room was very quiet. Someone knows she's here, Kessler said. And someone wanted you to know about her past before you decided whether to keep her. He left. Lorenzo stood at the window for a long time after that, and the thing that moved through him wasn't exactly anger, though it was in that territory. It was something older than anger, something that recognized, in the story Ray Kessler had just laid out, the specific shape of what happened when the people who were supposed to protect someone decided their own comfort was more important. He knew that shape very well. He'd been carrying it since he was 19 years old and had learned in a way that left a permanent impression that the world did not owe anyone the protection they thought they were entitled to, that you built your own protection or you didn't have it. He'd built his. He thought about a woman in an oversized gray cardigan, sitting in the back corner of a room full of people, holding herself still in a way that wasn't peace. That was practice. He thought about the word gap and what it actually contained. He picked up his phone and called C. Reeves. The announcement for the Strategic Analysis Division, he said. Prepare the draft, head of division. Ariana Vale. A pause. She declined the offer. She hasn't declined the announcement. Another pause. C. Reeves had been doing this job long enough to know the difference between when she should push back and when she shouldn't. I'll have a draft ready Monday. He ended the call. Outside, the lake was going dark under the October sky, and somewhere on the 14th floor of a building 4 blocks east, a woman who had spent a decade disappearing was sitting at a desk doing work that was years ahead of everyone around her, and didn't know yet that someone had found what she'd been hiding. Didn't know yet that finding it had made him angrier than he'd been in a very long time, and didn't know that the anger wasn't at her. She was about to find out. The announcement went out on a Monday. Not through HR. Not through the internal communication system that Meridian used for routine updates about parking validation and holiday schedules. It came as a direct email from the executive office of DeLuca Holdings, addressed to every employee at the firm, from the CFO down to the mailroom staff, with Lorenzo DeLuca's name at the bottom and no invitation for questions. Ariana read it at 8:51 a.m., 17 minutes after arriving, before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. Effective immediately, Meridian Capital Group will establish a dedicated strategic analysis division operating under direct executive oversight. This division will be led by Ariana Vale, previously senior analyst, whose work has demonstrated exceptional insight and has contributed significantly to this firm's most accurate projections over the past 4 years. Ms. Vale will hold the title of Head of Strategic Analysis with full divisional authority. Further details will follow through the executive office. She read it twice. Then she sat very still, with her hands flat on the desk, and her coffee going cold beside her keyboard, and the particular sensation moving through her chest that she recognized as the specific precursor to panic. Not panic itself, but its shadow, the moment before the body decided whether to run or lock down. She locked down. Derek appeared at her cubicle at 8:54. His expression was a mixture of genuine delight and the slightly stunned quality of someone who'd just witnessed something they hadn't expected. "Did you see? Oh, yes. That's you. That's literally you. He put your name in a company-wide..." "Derek. Okay. He lowered his voice, though there was nobody close enough to matter. "Did you know this was coming?" "No." "But you met with him last week." "I declined the offer." Derek stared at her. "You declined? And he announced it anyway?" She didn't answer. She was looking at the email again, at the specific phrase whose work has demonstrated exceptional insight, at the way it sat there on her screen like something that couldn't be taken back. "Is that legal?" Derek asked. "He owns the company." "Right, but Derek." She finally looked at him. "I need to think." He left. She could hear him, 30 seconds later, telling someone else what he'd just heard, and she understood that by 9:15 the entire floor would know, and by 9:30 it would be on 32, and by noon there would be implications she couldn't fully map yet, spreading through the organization like water finding every available crack. She picked up her phone and dialed C. Reeves. It rang twice. "Executive office? This is Ariana Vale. I need 5 minutes with Mr. DeLuca today." A pause that was slightly too measured to be neutral. "Mr. DeLuca has a full schedule. I can look at..." "Today," Ariana said. "This morning. Tell him I said the word he used. Gap." A longer pause. "I'll call you back within the hour." She had her call back in 11 minutes. 10 a.m., 32nd floor. She spent the intervening time finishing the report she'd been working on, because the report needed finishing, and because she had learned over 10 years that work was the most reliable anchor she had when everything else was moving. Tick. He was behind his desk when she walked in. He looked up, and his expression had that same quality it had carried in their first meeting. Not quite neutral, not quite readable, but attentive in the specific way of someone who was tracking more than the surface of what was happening. She sat down without being asked. "You announced it without my agreement," she said. "I did." "That's not how offers work." "No." He folded his hands on the desk. "It's how decisions work. You can refuse to show up. The title exists either way." The directness of it was almost jarring. She'd been prepared for deflection, for the polished corporate language that wrapped coercive decisions in the appearance of collaboration. What she got instead was just the fact of what he'd done, stated plainly, without apology. Why? She said. Because your work belongs in front of people who can use it. Because you've been functioning at a level that should have been recognized 4 years ago and hasn't been. And because, he said, and his voice shifted slightly, not softer but more precise. Someone sent me an anonymous message the week of the acquisition. About you. The temperature in the room didn't change. Her body registered it anyway. What kind of message? She said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. The kind that was designed to make me question whether to keep you employed here. She held his eyes. And did it? It made me investigate. He paused. I found things that didn't match the version of events someone wanted me to have. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed. Dense, pressurized, the kind that existed when something that had been locked away for a long time was being referenced in open air for the first time. She felt it in her throat, in the back of her jaw, in the deliberate steadiness of her hands on the arms of the chair. What exactly did you find? She said. Enough to know that what happened to you 10 years ago was manufactured, that the photographs were fabricated, that the people responsible made a deliberate calculation to destroy your professional and personal reputation to serve their own interests, and that it worked because you didn't have anyone in your corner with the resources to fight it. The room was very quiet. She had imagined this moment, in the abstract, in the way you imagine things you were simultaneously certain would never happen and couldn't stop rehearsing. She had imagined someone finding the real version of the story. She had never imagined what it would feel like to sit across from that person and have them say it out loud without flinching. It felt like being cut open with something very clean and very sharp. I don't need, she started. I know you don't need anything from me, he said. I'm telling you what I know because you deserve to know that I know it. That's all. She breathed in through her nose, slow and even, and stared at a point slightly past his shoulder until the pressure behind her eyes receded to a manageable distance. The announcement stands, he said, not as something I'm doing for you, as something I'm doing because it's what the work warrants. There's a difference. I understand the difference. Then we don't need to keep arguing about whether you deserve it. She looked at him directly. What do you want from me? It came out more blunt than she'd intended, but she didn't take it back. He held it for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not discomfort, exactly, but an acknowledgement that the question was a fair one and deserved a straight answer. The work, he said. That's all. She sat with that. There are people in this building, she said carefully, who will make your life difficult over this decision. I'm aware. Some of them have been here longer than I have. Some of them expected this kind of visibility. I know who they are. I'm not a political asset, she said. I don't know how to function in those dynamics. I never learned how because I spent 10 years actively avoiding them. If you put me in a room with your board and your senior partners expecting, I'm not putting you in a room to perform, he said. I'm putting you in a room because your analysis is better than anything I've seen from this firm, and I need that at the table when I'm making decisions, not filtered through 3 layers of management who are protecting their own positions. He paused. You'll have full support from this office. Any resource you need, any friction from below, it comes to me. And the anonymous message. I'm handling it. She looked at him. That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting today. She stood. The chair scraped back slightly on the floor. She stood with her hands at her sides and thought, not for the first time in this man's presence, about the specific architecture of what he was offering and what it cost. 1 week, she said. I need 1 week to think about the actual shape of the role before I agree to anything structural. You have it. She walked to the door and she was almost through it when he said without inflection, the person who sent the message. They're watching this company. They know you're here. She stopped. Her hand was on the doorframe. They wanted me to have a reason to remove you before you became visible, he said, which means they're afraid of what happens when you do. She didn't turn around. I'll be in touch, she said. She left. The fallout started before lunch. It came first from Paul Graves, the director of strategic planning, who had been at Meridian for 9 years and operated with the cultivated territorial confidence of a man who understood his value to the organization and had never been seriously threatened by anyone below his pay grade. He appeared at Marcus Chen's desk at 11:30, which Ariana could see from her cubicle at the right angle. And the conversation was brief and had the body language of a man making a point he considered obvious. Marcus came to her at 11:45. He sat in Derek's chair again. This time he didn't try for casual. "Paul Graves wants a meeting," he said. "With me?" "With both of us. About the announcement." He hesitated. "He's been here 9 years, Ariana. The strategic analysis function has historically sat inside his department. What DeLuca did this morning is DeLuca's call to make?" "Right. But operationally." "Marcus." She pulled off her glasses, which she didn't need, and set them on the desk. Without them, her face felt slightly exposed, and she watched him notice that, and then try not to let her see him noticing. "Paul Graves can want whatever meeting he wants. The announcement came from the executive office. My position, if I take it, reports to the executive office. That organizational structure doesn't require Paul Graves's consent." "I know that. He knows that. But there are already conversations happening upstairs about what this means for reporting lines, for budgets, for... That's not my problem today." He exhaled. Can you meet with him? As a courtesy?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Set it up. This afternoon, not this morning. And Marcus, I'm not there to negotiate the announcement. That's not on the table." He nodded, relieved in the particular way of a man who had delivered an uncomfortable message and gotten out the other side without it blowing up on him directly. He left. Ariana put her glasses back on and stared at her screen and thought about the word watching. Paul Graves was 52, silver-haired in a way he clearly felt worked in his favor, and had the handshake of a man who had used handshakes as instruments his entire adult life. His office was on 15, a step up from the analyst floor, a step below the executive suite, the specific middle ground of the institutional middle tier. He had the kind of decor that telegraphed ambition, that had found its ceiling and made its peace with that. Tasteful art, a good desk, a window with an adequate view. He offered her coffee. She declined. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, which in her experience was what people said when they intended to be anything but. "This announcement caught a lot of people off guard, including me." "I imagine it did." "I've been running strategic planning here for 9 years. The function DeLuca is describing, the scope of it, that's work that's been done inside my department. Work that I've overseen." He paused, with the precise timing of someone who had rehearsed this. "I want to understand what the new structure looks like, how the divisions will interact, whether there's room for a collaborative approach." She looked at him. He was looking back with the particular expression of a man who was being polite while also communicating clearly that he considered the situation a problem that needed correcting. "I haven't formally accepted the role yet," she said. He blinked. "A recalibration." "Oh, but if I do, the structure will be what the announcement described. A division reporting directly to the executive office. Independent scope." She kept her voice even. "I'm not going to be able to tell you more than that because I don't know more than that yet. I think what I'm asking," he said, the warmth in his voice cooling just slightly, "is whether you think this is the right move. For the firm. You've been here 4 years. You know how things work here. Pulling a function out of an existing department, it creates friction. It creates confusion about accountability. I'm not questioning your abilities," he added, in the tone of a man absolutely questioning her abilities, "but there are structural considerations that someone at your level might not have full visibility into." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Someone at my level," she said. His expression stayed exactly where it was, which was its own kind of tell. "I've been doing strategic analysis for this firm since I arrived," she said. Her voice was still even, but something in it had changed, had taken on the specific quality of a line being drawn rather than a point being made. "The reports that have gone to your department, the projections that have been presented to clients under the team's name. I've written the majority of them. You know that. Marcus knows that. I'm not saying that as a complaint. That was the structure, and I worked inside it. But let's be accurate about what my level means." He was quiet. "I appreciate the conversation," she said, and stood. "I'll let you know when I've made a decision about the role." She left his office with her pulse elevated in a way she didn't particularly like, the specific physical signature of a confrontation she hadn't wanted and had handled anyway. And she took the stairs back to 14 and sat at her desk and pressed the heels of her hands against the surface for a moment and breathed. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't pick up. She picked up. Ms. Vale? The voice was male, precise, with a formality that didn't feel like professional courtesy. It felt like a weapon being kept sheathed. My name is Edward Harlow. I represent the Ashcroft family. The floor dropped out of her stomach. She kept her face completely still, though there was no one watching her. I don't have anything to say to anyone representing that family. I understand I'm not calling to ask anything of you. I'm calling to pass along a message from Damien Ashcroft, who would like, no, an opportunity to speak with you privately. He's aware that you've recently come to the attention of certain parties in the city, and he has information that he believes. I said no. Her voice came out quieter than she intended, which was somehow more final than volume. Don't call this number again. She ended the call. She sat very still. The word watching sat in her chest like something with weight. They knew she was here. They had sent the anonymous message to Lorenzo, and now they were calling her directly. Which meant they were worried. Which meant whatever Lorenzo had found in his investigation was something they wanted managed before it became a problem for them. She was not a pawn anymore. She understood that in this moment, with a clarity that had no warmth in it whatsoever, she was a threat. She didn't know yet whether that made her safer or more exposed. She pulled up her email, opened a new message, addressed it to C. Reeves. Please tell Mr. DeLuca I'm prepared to discuss the role in more detail at his earliest convenience. She sent it. She sat back in her chair. Derek glanced over from his desk, clocked her expression, and made the specific calculation that now was not the time for conversation. He turned back to his screen. She thought about Elliot Ashcroft, the name that had been in Lorenzo's file, the brother, the one who had made the calculation 11 years ago. She thought about the fact that someone in that family's orbit had watched the acquisition news and known her name and moved fast enough to send a message to Lorenzo before the first all-hands meeting. She thought about what that meant, about how carefully she had been watched. For how long? She thought about 10 years of a life built to stay below the radar, and the specific bitterness of discovering that the radar had never lost her. Lorenzo met with Ray Kessler at 6 p.m. after the building had largely emptied. Kessler laid a single sheet on the desk. Elliot Ashcroft placed 3 phone calls in the 36 hours following the acquisition announcement. One to the communications firm that handled the original image fabrication. That firm is under new management, but the principle is the same. One to an attorney named Harlow, one to Damien Ashcroft. Damien, Lorenzo said. He's been living in New York, investment banking. He came back to Chicago 2 days ago. Lorenzo looked at the sheet. He's here. He's here. The quiet in the room had a specific texture. Harlow called her today, Kessler said. Lorenzo's jaw tightened, the only visible shift. She answered. She shut it down, 37 seconds. A pause. She emailed your office afterward, said she's ready to discuss the role. Lorenzo stood, walked to the window. The city outside was going dark, the lake invisible now, the lights coming up across the skyline in the particular way of a city that never actually stopped watching itself. She figured out that they're scared, he said. Seems like it. Good. He turned back to the room. Elliot Ashcroft has been protecting that fabrication for 11 years. He's watching because he thinks whatever I found is a problem for him. He's right. He paused. How solid is the forensic case? Solid enough for civil, possibly criminal, depending on what jurisdiction and what a DA wants to do with image-based fraud statutes from that period. Kessler hesitated. There's one complication. Tell me. The principal at the communications firm, he's kept records. Insurance records, basically. Documentation of who commissioned what. Kessler met his eyes. He'll talk if approached correctly, but if Elliot Ashcroft gets to him first, make sure that doesn't happen. Kessler nodded. He gathered his materials. At the door again, he paused again. It was becoming a habit between them, these threshold moments. She doesn't know the full scope of what we found. The Elliot connection. The documentation. No. You're going to have to tell her. I know. She's going to want to know why you went looking in the first place. Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. Outside, Chicago pushed its lights up against the dark, relentless, and indifferent to the specific weight of any particular story happening inside any particular building within its grid. "Because I looked at her in that room," he said finally, not to Kessler, not quite to himself, "and I saw something I recognized." Kessler had the sense to leave without responding to that. Lorenzo stood at the window for a long time. He thought about a woman who had rebuilt her life around the specific project of becoming invisible, who had done it with a discipline and a precision that, under other circumstances, he would have called extraordinary. He thought about the phone call she'd ended in 37 seconds, and the email she'd sent immediately after, and what both of those things said about the kind of person she was when her back was against the wall. He thought about Damian Ashcroft, back in Chicago, and the specific calculation that a man like that would make when he realized the woman he'd failed to protect 11 years ago was now standing next to someone who had the resources and the inclination to burn his family's carefully protected secret to the ground. His phone lit up on the desk. An unknown number. He picked it up. Mr. DeLuca. The voice was smooth, careful, carrying the specific register of old money that had learned to sound like it had nothing to prove because it had never needed to. "My name is Elliot Ashcroft. I think we should meet." Lorenzo looked out at the city. "I think so too," he said. And in a conference room on the 14th floor, 4 blocks away, Ariana Vale was still at her desk at 6:23 p.m., the floor around her empty, her screen glowing in the dark of the vacant office, running yield projections for a company that was no longer the same company it had been 3 weeks ago, in a life that was no longer the same life it had been that morning. And she had the particular sensation, low and certain in the base of her chest, that the careful distance she had maintained between herself and everything that had hurt her was about to collapse entirely, and that this time, for reasons she couldn't fully, she didn't go home until 7:40 that night. The floor was empty by then, the overhead lights on their automated schedule dimming to the energy-saving low that made the whole space look like the inside of something that had been abandoned mid-thought. She packed her laptop, her thermos, her notebook with the handwritten margin calculations she still did on paper because old habits from Northwestern died hard, and she stood at her cubicle for a moment in the dim light looking at Derek's empty chair and the succulent on the corner of her desk and the ordered surface of 4 years of careful, invisible work. She thought about the email she'd sent, prepared to discuss the role. She thought about what had made her send it. Not the announcement, not Paul Graves and his condescension, not even the call from Harlow, though that had sharpened something in her that had been trying to stay soft. It was the word watching, the understanding that the distance she'd built hadn't been distance at all, that somewhere in the architecture of the life she'd constructed, there had been a window she didn't know about, and someone had been looking through it the whole time. If they could see her anyway, she was done paying the price of being invisible. That was the logic. Clean, functional, the kind of logic she trusted. She took the stairs. She walked home through the cold. She slept 4 hours. Lorenzo met Elliot Ashcroft at 8 a.m. the next morning in a private room at the Meridian Club, which was a piece of staging on Elliot's part, neutral ground on his terms, the kind of old-money Chicago institution where men like Elliot Ashcroft had been having conversations like this one for generations. Paneled walls, heavy furniture, the specific smell of a room that had absorbed a century of decisions made by people who believed their decisions were beyond consequence. Elliot was 55, lean, with the groomed precision of a man who understood that appearance was its own form of argument. He was already seated when Lorenzo arrived, which was another piece of staging, the suggestion of someone relaxed, unhurried, at home. He stood when Lorenzo entered, extended a hand with the practiced warmth of a family that had been shaking the right hands for a very long time. Lorenzo shook it, sat down, said nothing. The waiter poured coffee, left. Elliot smiled, the specific smile of a man who had opened negotiations this way 100 times. "Thank you for coming." "I didn't come for you," Lorenzo said. "I came to hear what you're prepared to say to my face." The smile stayed, but something behind it recalibrated. "I appreciate directness." He set his cup down. "I understand you've been looking into some old business involving a woman named Ariana Vale." "I have." "Then you understand there are some complex histories involved, things that may not look on the surface the way they actually are." "I understand exactly how they are," Lorenzo said. That's why we're here. Elliot looked at him for a moment. The smile was gone now, which was more honest. What is it you want, Mr. DeLuca? I want to know what you're planning. I'm not planning anything. I reached out because I thought a conversation between reasonable men could prevent a situation that benefits no one. A situation. The past is complicated. People were hurt. The family, my family, made decisions under difficult circumstances that I don't think anyone involved looks back on with pride. He paused on that, like it was a concession. It wasn't a concession. It was a test of whether Lorenzo would accept the framing. Ms. Vale had a difficult experience. I understand that. If there's a path toward some kind of resolution that acknowledges her, you fabricated evidence to end her engagement and destroy her career, Lorenzo said. You used a communications firm to produce falsified intimate images of a woman who had done nothing except threaten your inheritance calculations. You distributed those images to her employer, her professional contacts, and the press. And then you threatened her with additional materials to prevent her from fighting back. He paused. That's not a complicated history. That's a list of things you did. The room was very quiet. Elliot's face had gone through several things in the space of those sentences and landed on something that was trying to be composed and wasn't quite making it. I'm going to need you to be careful, he said, and his voice had changed, the warmth entirely gone, something older and colder underneath. About the claims you're making and what you intend to do with them. I intend to give everything I have to Ariana Vale, Lorenzo said. What she does with it is her decision. That would be a mistake. For who? For everyone involved, including you. Elliot leaned forward slightly. I've done my own research, Mr. DeLuca. I understand who you are and how your holdings are structured. I understand that a very bright line exists between your legitimate businesses and certain other interests. I would imagine that line is something you're invested in maintaining. Lorenzo looked at him. A protracted legal situation, Elliot continued, the cadence smooth now, rehearsed, generates scrutiny. Media attention, the kind of investigative interest that tends to spread beyond its original subject. I would imagine that's the last thing you want attached to a newly acquired firm. The threat was clean, almost elegant. The specific kind of leverage that men like Elliot Ashcroft had been deploying since before Lorenzo was born. The suggestion that fighting back would cost more than standing down. Lorenzo picked up his coffee, drank it, set the cup down. I grew up in Bridgeport, he said. You know what that means. Elliot said nothing. It means I learned, early, that the people who used leverage like that were usually counting on the other person to blink. That the threat only worked if you believed the person making it had more to lose than you did. He stood. I don't blink, and I've already had my lawyers review the exposure question. The answer is none. He buttoned his jacket. I'll be in touch through formal channels, he said. Bring a better attorney than Harlow. He walked out of the Meridian Club into the cold morning, and he was 2 blocks away before he called Kessler. The documentation. How fast can you get it secured? Already done. Digital and physical copies in 3 separate locations. Good. Get everything to my legal team. I want the civil filing prepared by end of week, he paused, and find out what Elliot Ashcroft does next. He's not done. Ariana was in a meeting with Marcus and 2 members of the executive team's administrative staff, working through the actual structural details of what the new division would require in terms of resources and personnel, when her cell phone lit up on the table with a number she recognized. Her mother. She hadn't spoken to her mother in 14 months. She turned the phone face down, finished the meeting. When the room emptied at 11:30, she sat alone at the conference table and looked at the missed call for a long moment and then called back. It rang 4 times. Ariana? Her mother's voice had the careful quality it always had now, the wariness of a relationship that had survived something neither of them had fully named. I saw the news. What news? Your name. In the financial section. There was a piece about DeLuca Holdings acquiring Meridian, and they listed you as the new head of something. Her chest tightened. It was already in the press. Of course it was. A DeLuca acquisition was news, and a DeLuca announcement about personnel was the kind of thing that got picked up fast. I'm fine, Mom. I know you're fine. I'm not calling because I think you're not fine. A pause. I'm calling because I want you to know that we saw it, that your father and I, that we're proud. The word landed with the specific weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said. We've always been proud. I know that's not... I know, Ariana said. Her voice came out rough at the edges. She cleared it. I know, Ariana. I'm okay. I know you are. Her mother's voice had something in it now that wasn't quite crying, but was the territory around it. I wanted to hear your voice. They talked for 7 minutes. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't nothing. When she hung up, she sat in the empty conference room with the city outside the window going about its business, and she pressed her fingers against her mouth and held herself very still until the pressure behind her sternum settled to something manageable. Then she went back to work. The piece came out at 2:17 p.m. She found out when Derek appeared at her cubicle, phone in hand, with the expression of someone who had just watched something explode and wasn't sure if the shrapnel was going to reach them. "Don't read it," he said, which was exactly the wrong thing to say. She held out her hand. He gave her the phone. It was a financial news site she knew, mid-size, credible enough to be taken seriously and fast enough to have beaten the more careful outlets to the story. The headline read, "DeLuca's new pick, inside the shadowed past of Meridian's surprise appointment." She read it standing at her cubicle. She made herself read every sentence. The piece had most of the story she expected, the outline of the old scandal, the photographs, her departure from the professional world she'd been building. It framed it in the careful language of journalism that wanted to be seen as balanced while doing damage with precision. Allegations, disputed claims, questions that were never formally resolved. It quoted nobody by name. It cited 3 anonymous sources who confirmed the broad strokes of events that were 11 years old. But it also had something she did not expect. Near the bottom, in 2 paragraphs that landed like the whole point of the piece, it stated that sources familiar with DeLuca Holdings had raised questions about Lorenzo DeLuca's judgment in making a high-profile appointment connected to a scandal with financial implications, and that investigators, unspecified, unidentified, had allegedly found evidence suggesting the original allegations against Ariana Vale may have been partially corroborated by materials that had not been made public at the time. She read those 2 paragraphs 3 times. Partially corroborated. The fabrication, dressed up. Fed to a reporter by someone who understood how to use the language of due diligence to make a lie sound like a finding. She handed the phone back to Derek. She sat down. Her hands were flat on the desk. She could feel her pulse in her palms. She thought about the word partially and what it was designed to do. Not to convince anyone fully, but to create enough ambient doubt that anyone who wanted to question the appointment had a phrase they could point to. Enough to make colleagues hesitate. Enough to make the board nervous. Enough to make Lorenzo's decision look like a liability rather than a call. Elliot Ashcroft had moved faster than she expected. She picked up her phone and called Lorenzo's direct line, the number C. Reeves had sent her that morning as part of the role logistics. He picked up on the second ring. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "The partially corroborated line," she said. "It's fabricated. We know where it came from." "It doesn't matter where it came from. It's out there. The phrase is out there." She pressed her free hand flat against the desk, feeling the surface. "Your board is going to see it. Your partners are going to see it. Every person in this building who already had reservations about this appointment now has a sentence they can quote. Let me worry about the board." "I'm not calling about the board." Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "I'm calling because I need to know what the full picture is. What you actually found. All of it. Because someone just used your investigation to leak a counter-narrative, and I need to understand what they have access to and how." A pause. Not long. "Come upstairs," he said. C. Reeves was not at her desk. The outer office was empty. Ariana knocked once on the door that was already partway open and pushed through. Lorenzo was on his feet, which she'd come to understand was how he processed things that required action rather than analysis. He had his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the forearm. Kessler was there, seated, with a file on the table between them. She walked to the table and looked at Kessler. "Tell me what you found." He looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo nodded. Kessler opened the file. He walked her through it with the same methodical precision she imagined he used every time. The forensic image analysis, the communications firm, the paper trail that led to Elliot Ashcroft's commissioning of the fabrication, the legal correspondence, the threat letters. She listened without speaking, standing at the table with her arms at her sides, and she felt each piece land with a specific gravity that was different from anything she'd carried before. Because this wasn't the old familiar weight of the story she'd told herself. That she had been collateral damage in a family's social maneuvering, that she'd been in the wrong place, in the wrong life, and had paid for it. This was something else. This was a name, a specific human decision made by a specific person for a specific reason. Elliot, she said when Kessler finished. Yes. Not the family, not the Ashcroft machine in some general sense. Elliot made the call. Yes. She stood very still. Damien didn't know. Based on everything we have, no. Damien believed the images were real. He believed the accusations. Something in her chest moved in a way she didn't have a name for. 11 years of a specific story. The story of a man who had chosen his family over her, who had looked at her and decided the cost of fighting was too high. And underneath that story, a different one. A man who had been lied to as deliberately as she had been. Who had lost something he hadn't understood he was losing until it was already gone. She didn't have the capacity to fully process that right now. She looked at Kessler. The leak. Today's piece. Someone fed the reporter a counter-narrative. Where did it come from? The communications firm principal, Kessler said. Elliot got to him. Probably last night, after the meeting with Mr. DeLuca this morning went the wrong way for him. He paused. The principal fed the reporter a constructed version, language designed to create doubt without making a specific claim that could be challenged legally. What does the principal actually have? Kessler and Lorenzo exchanged a look. Tell me, she said. The principal has the original commission documentation, Kessler said. The evidence that exonerates you completely. But he also has copies of the fabricated materials that were used against you. And in the wrong hands or with the wrong framing, those copies become the corroborating materials the article references, she said. Yes. The room was quiet. She understood it fully now. Elliot Ashcroft had kept the original fabrication materials as insurance, proof of what he'd done, which was simultaneously proof of what he could do again. The principal had copies because that was how you ensured a client's continued cooperation. And now that principle was in play, being used to feed just enough material to journalists to make the counter-narrative feel substantiated. Can you secure the principal? She said. Get his testimony before Elliot neutralizes him? We're moving on that today, Lorenzo said. If he disappears or recants, what's the evidentiary situation? Weaker, Kessler said. Not gone. The forensic analysis stands on its own, but testimony would significantly strengthen a civil case. She nodded. She looked at the file on the table. She looked at the photograph that was part of it, a document log, a chain of communication, her name in the subject line of an email she'd never been supposed to see. There's something else, Kessler said. She looked at him. Damien Ashcroft came to the office this morning, before you arrived. He asked to see Mr. DeLuca. She went very still. He knows, Kessler said. Apparently Elliot told him, or enough of it that Damien understood what his brother had done. He came to, I'm not sure what he came to do. He was turned away. But he left a message. He pushed a folded note across the table. She didn't pick it up. He wants to meet with her, Kessler said to Lorenzo, not to her, in the specific tone of a man delivering information he understood was combustible. Lorenzo looked at her. The decision was hers, clearly, by the way he held himself back from it. She picked up the note. It was short. Damien's handwriting, which she recognized and wished she didn't, still the same slightly leftward slant from a right-handed man who'd learned to write at an angle. I didn't know. I need you to know I didn't know. I understand if that doesn't matter, but I need to say it to your face. Whatever you decide, so I'll accept it, please. She folded it, set it down. I need a minute, she said. Neither of them moved. Alone, she said. Lorenzo and Kessler left. The door closed. She stood at the table in the empty office, and she picked up the note again and held it, and she thought about 11 years and the particular mathematics of suffering, about how much of her life had been organized around the belief that everyone in that room had known, had looked at her and made a collective calculation. and that belief had been the foundation of every wall she'd built since. The invisibility, the oversized cardigans, the deliberate erasure of the woman she'd been before. And underneath all of it, a different truth. A man who had been as deceived as she was. A brother who had watched his own family be weaponized and had done nothing, understood nothing, grieved the wrong thing for 11 years while she had grieved the same. The note was shaking slightly. She realized her hands were shaking. She set the note on the table and pressed both palms flat until the trembling stopped, and she breathed through it, in and out, slow and even, the way she'd learned to manage the things her body did when the locked drawer forced itself open. When she was steady, she picked up her phone. She called a number. It rang twice. "Ms. Vale?" Harlow, the attorney, cautious, surprised. "Tell Damien Ashcroft I'll meet with him," she said. "Once. My choice of location. No attorneys, no family, no cameras. And tell him that whatever he says to me goes nowhere with Elliot. If I find out he's using the meeting to manage his brother's exposure, I understand." "I don't think you do," she said, "but pass it along." She ended the call. She stood in Lorenzo De Luca's empty office with the city outside the glass going silver and gray under an overcast sky. And she understood that the woman who had walked into this building 3 weeks ago, the one who took the stairs and wore glasses she didn't need and ate half a sandwich at her desk and counted silence as safety, was not going to be the woman who walked out of what was coming. That version of her had served its purpose. She had hidden long enough to survive. Now she was going to have to do something harder. She was going to have to stand still and let the whole thing find her, and trust. And this was the part that made her chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the specific terror of needing something from another person. Trust that the man on the other side of that door had not. Lorenzo was standing just outside the door when she opened it, not waiting in the performative sense, not leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression arranged for effect. Just standing. Like a man who had positioned himself close enough to be useful and far enough to give her the room she'd asked for, and had found a way to hold both of those things at the same time. She looked at him. He looked back. "I'm meeting with Damien," she said. "I know." Kessler heard the call. She felt a flicker of something. Not quite irritation, not quite surprise. "Do you monitor everything in this office?" "Yes." The directness of it short-circuited whatever response she'd been preparing. She exhaled. "I need you to understand that this meeting is mine, not yours, not Kessler's. I'm not going in wired, I'm not being followed, and whatever Damien tells me doesn't automatically become intelligence for your legal team." "Understood." "I mean it. I know you mean it." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not concerned. You can be concerned. Just do it from a distance." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but a shift in the quality of his stillness, like a man recognizing something he hadn't expected to find. "Tonight?" "Tomorrow morning. Somewhere public." She moved past him toward the elevator. "I'll be in early. I have 2 reports to finish before the board review." "Ariana." She stopped, turned. He was looking at her with that specific quality of attention she still hadn't fully learned to hold. The kind that didn't ask anything from her, but made her feel seen down to the structural level anyway. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "That's not weakness. That's just how things work better." She held it for a moment, the words and what was underneath them. "I've been doing it alone for 10 years, she said. "Give me a little time to remember how the other thing works." She took the elevator down. She met Damien Ashcroft at 8 a.m. at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, busy enough that they were 2 anonymous people at a corner table, quiet enough that a conversation could happen without being performed for an audience. She arrived first. She sat with her back to the wall and her hands around a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want, and she watched the door, and when he walked in, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not rage. Not the cold clarity of confirmed resentment that she'd been carrying like a stone in her pocket for 11 years. Just recognition. The specific, devastating recognition of a person who had also been taken apart by the same hands. Damien Ashcroft was 41 now. He looked like a man who had spent a decade trying to build something over a wound that wouldn't close properly. Thinner than she remembered, the particular careful grooming of a person who had learned to use appearance as armor. He saw her, and something in his face broke open for just a second before he controlled it. He sat down across from her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I didn't know," he said. His voice was quiet. Not the rehearsed quiet of someone who had practiced the line. The raw quiet of a man who had been saying those words in his own head for long enough that saying them out loud was almost a relief. "I need you to believe that. I know I don't have the right to need anything from you, but I need you to know it." She looked at him. "What did you know?" "I knew the images appeared. I knew what they looked like. I knew my mother told me it was over, and my family's attorney said fighting it publicly would make it worse, and..." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I believed them. I believed them because it was easier, and because I was 29 years old and I didn't have the spine to..." "When did you find out the truth?" He met her eyes. 4 days ago. Elliot told me. Not because he wanted to, because he thought I could help him manage the DeLuca situation. He thought telling me the real version would make me understand the stakes and get in line. He laughed, short and humorless and painful to hear. He miscalculated. "What did you do?" "I went to DeLuca's office." He looked at his hands on the table. "Which apparently you know." "What do you want, Damien?" "I want to testify." He looked up. "Whatever DeLuca's lawyers are building, I'll testify. I'll put my name on it. I'll go on record about what Elliot told me, about the fabrication, about all of it. I know that burns my family. I know what it costs." His voice held. "It costs less than what it cost you." She stared at him. She had built, over 11 years, a very particular image of Damien Ashcroft. She had needed that image to be clean. The clean image of a man who had chosen cowardice, who had looked at her and decided she wasn't worth the fight. That image had been load-bearing. It had held up entire sections of the architecture of who she'd become. "If you testify," she said carefully, "Elliot will destroy you. Probably. He'll use everything he has. Your professional reputation, your personal history, whatever leverage he's accumulated over 20 years of..." Ariana. Her name in his mouth, after 11 years, landed somewhere she hadn't anticipated. "I know what he'll do. I've watched him do it to other people my whole life and told myself it was just how things worked." He paused. "He did it to you. And I let it happen because I didn't look close enough. And then I spent 11 years not looking because looking meant knowing, and knowing meant..." "Damien, I know." He stopped, breathed. "I know, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't..." "It doesn't fix it," she said. Not cruel, just precise. "It doesn't give me back what I lost. It doesn't undo 10 years. I need you to understand that I'm not sitting here because I need your apology. I'm sitting here because the legal case needs your testimony, and that's a practical calculation, not a..." She stopped, because her voice was doing something she didn't want it to do. She breathed through it. "That's not a personal reconciliation. That's just what's true." He nodded. His eyes were wet. He didn't wipe them, which, she thought, was probably the most dignity he could manage in the moment, and she let him have it. "I'll contact DeLuca's legal team," he said. "Today." "Okay?" He stood. He hesitated. "You're different." She looked up at him. "Then I remembered," he said. "Stronger, or not stronger. You were always strong, something else." He paused, searching for the word. "Less careful about hiding it." She didn't answer that. He left. She sat with her coffee for 3 minutes after he walked out. She watched Michigan Avenue through the window, the morning crowd, the particular Chicago October cold that made people walk fast and keep their chins down, all of it proceeding with complete indifference to the specific seismic shift that had just happened at a corner table in a coffee shop that would never know it. Then she picked up her phone and called Lorenzo. "He'll testify," she said. A pause, then, "That changes things significantly." "I know, get your lawyers moving." She paused. "And Lorenzo." "Yeah. Thank you for finding it, for not..." She stopped. The sentence required more vulnerability than she had available standing on a public sidewalk in the cold. Just, thank you. A pause that was careful and warm in equal measure. "Get to the office. You said you had reports." She almost laughed. "I do." She went to the office. The gala invitation arrived at 3 p.m. DeLuca Holdings' annual industry reception. The firm's first major public event since the acquisition, held in 3 days at the Grand Meridian Ballroom, attendance expected from every significant name in Chicago's financial and civic landscape. The email came from C. Reeves, addressed to the full executive tier, and at the bottom, a separate line. Ms. Vale, Mr. DeLuca asks that you attend as head of strategic analysis. Black tie. She read it twice. Derek appeared. He'd been appearing at her cubicle more frequently since the announcement, less out of nosiness and more out of a genuine uncertainty about whether his desk neighbor had somehow become a different person and what that meant for their working relationship. Is that the gala invite? Yes. Are you going? She stared at the email. Apparently, that's like everyone's going to be there, the whole industry. I'm aware, Derek. He sat on the edge of his desk, which he only did when he was genuinely concerned. Hey, look, I know you don't love visibility, or people, or events where people gather to be visible. He paused. Are you okay? She looked at him. Derek Finn, who had sat next to her for 4 years and brought her a succulent for her work anniversary and asked no questions about anything she didn't offer, who had been, in the specific limited way of office proximity, the closest thing to a witness to her daily life for 4 years, and had been careful about it in a way she'd never properly acknowledged. I'm okay, she said. And then, because it was true and he'd earned it, I will be. He nodded. Didn't push further. Turned back to his screen. She looked at the email one more time. Black tie. 3 days. The whole city watching. She typed back to C. Reeves. Confirmed. Then she sat with what that meant. Well, Elliot Ashcroft made his move at 4:45 p.m. It came through the firm's board, specifically through the 2 board members who had been on Meridian's governing body before the acquisition and whose positions DeLuca had retained in the interest of operational continuity. A formal request for an emergency board meeting to review the appointment of Ariana Vale in light of, and the phrasing was careful, recently surfaced concerns about the due diligence process for executive-level appointments at the newly restructured firm. It landed on Lorenzo's desk at 4:51. He read it once, called his general counsel, a woman named Patricia Moore, who had been with him for 7 years and had the specific gift of sounding completely unrattled regardless of what she was looking at. It's a procedural challenge, she said, dressed up as governance concern. They're not challenging the acquisition. They can't. It's done. They're challenging the appointment specifically, using the board's retained oversight rights on executive personnel under the acquisition agreement. Can they force a review? They can force a meeting. They can't force an outcome. But a meeting means delay, and delay means the news cycle on the article this morning continues without a counter-narrative. And schedule the meeting, Lorenzo said, a pause. Excuse me? Schedule it. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. I want Ariana there. Lorenzo, if you put her in that room without preparation, she'll be prepared. He paused. She's been preparing for this her whole career. She just didn't know it was this specific meeting. He ended the call. He called Ariana directly. She picked up on the first ring. I know, she said. C. Reeves just forwarded me the board notice. Tomorrow, 8 a.m. I need you in that room. A pause that wasn't hesitation. It was calculation, which was different. Who'll be there? Board members. Graves, probably, if Elliot has been working him. My legal team. You. He paused. It's going to be a room full of people who have spent the last 48 hours reading that article and deciding what to think about it. And you want me to stand in front of them. I want you to sit at the table as head of strategic analysis, not as a subject of their concern, as a peer. He paused. Bring the yield model, the Q4 projections, bring everything that shows what you actually do and what it's actually worth. Let them ask their questions about the article and let the work answer for you. She was quiet for a moment. Ariana, I'm here. Her voice was steady, in the specific way of a person who had found the solid ground and was standing on it deliberately. I'll be there at 7:45. Good. Lorenzo. A pause. Elliot's going to be watching that meeting. Whatever happens in it becomes his next move. I know. If the board asks questions I can't answer in that room, about the legal situation, about the forensics, about the case, leave that to Moore. Your job tomorrow is to be exactly who you are. That's enough. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, Her voice had something in it that was quieter than her usual register, something closer to the actual core of her. You keep saying that like it's simple. It's not simple, he said. It's just true. She was at her desk at 6 a.m. the next morning. The building was empty except for the overnight security on the lobby level and the particular hum of a structure that never went entirely dormant. She sat at her cubicle in the low light and she worked, pulling the most current version of the strategic analysis framework she'd been building for 3 weeks. The Q4 projections, the risk-adjusted yield models, the competitive landscape analysis that she'd completed at twice the depth anyone had asked for because that was how she worked when she had the room to work. She printed nothing. She had it all in her head, organized in the specific way of a mind that had spent a decade doing very little except getting better at the one thing it was best at. At 7:15, she went to the bathroom, looked in the mirror, and did something she hadn't done in a long time. She took off the glasses. She looked at her own face without the prop. It was still her face. It had always been her face. The disguise had never actually hidden it. It had just given her somewhere to look that wasn't directly at herself. She left the glasses on the bathroom counter. She went back to her desk. She took off the oversized cardigan she'd worn over her blouse and folded it over the back of her chair. She went upstairs. The boardroom on the 32nd floor held 12 people at capacity. At 8 a.m., it held 9. Lorenzo at the head, Patricia Moore to his right, Ariana 3 seats down with nothing in front of her except her own hands. Across the table, 2 board members, older men with the accumulated weight of institutional conservatism in every line of their posture. Paul Graves, who had clearly been doing exactly what she'd suspected, seated 2 chairs from the board members with the look of a man who believed he was about to witness something satisfying. And 2 people she didn't recognize who were presumably with the board members' council. Nobody said anything for the first 30 seconds after the last person sat down. Then the senior board member, a man named Hargrove, 68, who had been on Meridian's board for 12 years and had the deliberate cadence of someone who had learned to make due process sound like weapons, opened a folder. We've called this meeting because the board has a retained oversight responsibility for executive appointments under the terms of the acquisition agreement, he said. Specifically, we have questions about the process by which Ms. Vale's appointment was made and whether the full context of her professional history was appropriately considered. Her professional history was reviewed in full, Lorenzo said, by me, personally. The article published yesterday raises questions that... The article published yesterday contains material fed to the reporter by a source with a documented financial interest in undermining this appointment, Moore said, smooth and immediate. We have documentation establishing that. Hargrove looked at her, at Lorenzo. Then, with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement, at Ariana. Ms. Vale, he said, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to the concerns directly. There are allegations in the public record, whatever their source, about events from your earlier career that... I know what the allegations are, she said. Her voice was even, not cold, even. The specific register of a person who had decided what they were and was done explaining themselves. Hargrove paused, slightly surprised by the directness. Then you understand why the board feels it has a responsibility to... I understand why the board feels it has a responsibility, she said. I also understand that the function of this meeting, regardless of how it's framed, is to evaluate whether my presence here creates risk for the organization. She looked at him steadily. So let me address that directly. The room was very quiet. Even Graves had stopped moving. The allegations from 11 years ago were fabricated, she said. Not disputed, fabricated. The images were not real. The scandal was manufactured by a specific person for a specific financial purpose, and that person is currently attempting to use this organization as a vehicle to continue preventing the truth from being established. She paused. Legal filings establishing all of this are being prepared and will be public within the week. So the question you're actually evaluating is not whether I have a problematic past. The question is whether this organization wants to make a decision in the next hour based on pressure from the same party that is about to face a civil fraud suit. She let that sit. That's a governance question. I'll leave it with you. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo said nothing. He didn't need to. Graves cleared his throat. There are also questions about the organizational structure, the reporting lines. The reporting lines are as announced, Lorenzo said. His voice was flat and final in the specific way of a man who had made a decision and was no longer interested in relitigating it. The structure serves the firm's strategic needs. That's not a board matter under the acquisition agreement. Hargrove looked at his folder, closed it, looked at the other board member, a silent exchange, the kind that happened between people who had been in rooms together long enough to communicate without words. "We'll want to see the legal documentation when it's available," Hargrove said. "You'll have it," Moore said. "In the interim," he paused. "The appointment stands pending that review." It was not a victory exactly. It was a held position, a deferred fight, a room that had come in to challenge something and left without having successfully done it. But in the specific arithmetic of the situation, it was enough. Graves stood without making eye contact with anyone. Left. Hargrove paused at the door. He looked at Ariana with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something between assessment and something older, something that might have been the beginning of reappraisal. "Ms. Vale," he said, "the work in your divisional brief was impressive." He left. The room emptied until it was her and Lorenzo and Moore, and then Moore received a phone call and stepped out. And it was just the two of them in the boardroom with the city outside the glass going about its indifferent morning business. She sat at the table and felt the adrenaline leaving her system the way it always did. Slowly, like water draining, leaving behind a tiredness that had weight to it. Lorenzo was looking at her. "You didn't need me in there," he said. "I needed you in there," she said. "Don't do that." "I'm saying that I know what you're saying." She looked at him. "I know what I did. I also know I couldn't have done it 3 weeks ago. Don't take the room away from what it was." He held her eyes for a moment. Something in his expression was unguarded in a way she was beginning to recognize. The way he looked when he'd stopped calculating and was just present. "The gala's tomorrow," he said. "I know." Elliot Ashcroft received an invitation through one of the board members' offices. She went still. "He's coming." "Probably." Lorenzo's jaw was tight. "Damien will also be there. He confirmed with my team this morning." The specific geometry of it arranged itself in her mind. Tomorrow night, a ballroom full of the city's financial and social architecture, the people who had watched her disappear a decade ago, and the people who had built their lives over the wreckage of hers, and she was supposed to walk into it as herself. No cardigan, no glasses, no back corner. "Elliot's going to try something at the gala," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You know that?" "Yes. And you're telling me now, the night before, because you deserve to know what you're walking into," he said. "Not so you'll stay home. Because I think you'll go anyway, and I'd rather you go knowing." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had pulled the locked drawer open and put everything inside it on a table in clean light, and then let her decide what to do with it. This man who had never once, in 3 weeks of overturning her life, asked her to be grateful. "What's he going to do?" she said. "My best read. He's going to try to confront you publicly. Make the scandal visible in a room full of the exact people you'd least want to have it be visible in front of. Humiliate you into retreating. If you retreat, the legal case loses its momentum, the board loses its nerve, and he walks away with the narrative intact. And if I don't retreat," Lorenzo was quiet for a moment, "then it's over for him. A public confrontation that you survived, in front of those people, in that room, that's the last thing his narrative can withstand." She breathed. "So the gala is the battle," she said. "Yes." She stood, straightened her blouse, picked up the folder of materials she'd brought and hadn't needed. "Then I need something to wear," she said. He almost smiled. She turned away before she could fully see it, because she needed to hold the momentum of what she was feeling, and the almost smile was the kind of thing that she found the dress herself. Lorenzo had offered, through C. Reeves, with the particular careful indirection of a man who understood he was operating close to a boundary, to have someone assist. She had declined. This was not something she was willing to have done for her. It had to be a choice she made with her own hands, standing in her own body, in a store where nobody knew her name. She went alone on a Thursday evening, 2 hours after the board meeting, still carrying the specific tiredness of a day that had asked more of her than most. She walked into a boutique on Oak Street that she had passed 100 times in 4 years and never entered, and she stood inside it for a moment in the particular way of someone re-entering a space they'd once known and had to relearn from scratch. The saleswoman who approached her was young, observant, and had the gift of reading what a customer needed without making them say it. She looked at Ariana once, not at the oversized blouse, not at the absent glasses, but at the face, and said, "Do you know what you're looking for?" "Something I can stand up in," Ariana said, "all night." The woman nodded, like that was the most sensible brief she'd heard all week. It took 40 minutes. The dress was deep navy, simple in its structure, fitted without being constructed. The kind of garment that didn't ask anything of the body wearing it except that it show up. No ornamentation, no performance, just clean lines and fabric that held. She looked at herself in the fitting room mirror for a long time. The woman looking back was 34 years old and had the particular quality of someone who had been through something the mirror couldn't fully show. Ariana Vale, who had spent a decade erasing herself, standing in a dress the color of deep water, in a store on Oak Street 2 days before the ballroom. She bought it. She walked home in the cold. She slept 6 hours, which was more than she expected. The day of the gala moved the way high-stakes days always moved, too fast in the morning and too slow in the afternoon, with the particular quality of time that built pressure rather than releasing it. She was at her desk by 7:30. She finished the Q4 framework she'd been building and sent it to Lorenzo's office with a brief note. She responded to 3 emails from new divisional staff, 2 analysts who had been assigned to her team that morning and were navigating the specific uncertainty of not knowing yet what their new supervisor expected of them. She wrote back to both with clear, direct answers and no preamble. At noon, Kessler appeared at her cubicle door. He never came to her floor. She looked up. "The civil filing went in this morning," he said. "Publicly docketed. Elliot Ashcroft and the communications firm named as defendants. Image-based fraud, defamation, tortious interference with professional relations." She set down her pen. "The principal testified? Gave a full statement last night. His documentation authenticated. Chain of commission from Elliot to the firm is established in the filing." He paused. "Damian Ashcroft gave a supporting affidavit this morning, corroborating what Elliot told him about commissioning the fabrication." She breathed. "It's done," she said. "The filing is done. The legal process runs its course from here." He looked at her with the directness of a man who had spent his career assessing people and had made some kind of assessment of her over the past 3 weeks. "But the filing is public. Every news outlet that ran the article yesterday will have it by end of day." She nodded. "There's one more thing," Kessler said. He reached into the folder under his arm and set a single sheet on her desk. A printout of a short news item, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. She read it. Elliot Ashcroft had issued a statement through his attorney, briefly worded, stating that he was aware of the civil filing and would be responding through appropriate legal channels. The statement included no denial. The absence of a denial in a defamation-adjacent case was the specific kind of silence that spoke clearly in legal language. He knew the documentation was real. He'd always known. She set the printout down. "Thank you," she said to Kessler. He nodded, left. She sat at her desk in the middle of the day on the floor she'd been sitting on for 4 years, and she felt the specific quality of something ending. Not with noise, not with ceremony, but with the quiet settling of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped registering it as a weight, and had come to believe it was just the shape of herself. It wasn't. She was lighter without it. She hadn't expected it to feel like that. She arrived at the Grand Meridian Ballroom at 7:58 p.m. She had taken a car, alone, and she had sat in the back of it for the 15-minute ride with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the window and the city moving past in the dark. And she had not given herself a pep talk or run scenarios or rehearsed anything. She had just let herself feel what she felt, the particular compound of fear and exhaustion and something that was older and steadier than either, the thing that had kept her functional through 10 years of deliberate invisibility and was now going to have to carry her through something different. The ballroom was on the 2nd floor of the hotel, accessed through a lobby that was already full when she arrived. 200 people in black tie. The particular density of Chicago's financial world condensed into a single space, the air carrying the specific pressure of money and position and the performance of both. photographers near the entrance, a receiving line she bypassed by entering through a side corridor that C. Reeves had mentioned in a logistical email. She checked her coat. She stood at the entrance to the ballroom for exactly 3 seconds, looking at the room. Then she walked in. She felt it. The moment a room shifts, the specific physics of attention redirecting. She had felt it before, in a different life when she was 24, and walked into rooms with the easy confidence of someone who hadn't yet learned what rooms could do to you. She felt it now differently, not as a welcome, but as a reckoning. Heads turning. The particular quality of recognition in people who had seen the article and were now mapping it against the woman standing in the doorway. She held herself straight and moved into the room. The first person to approach her was someone she didn't know. A woman in her 50s, silver-haired, with a firm handshake and the card of a managing director at a competing firm. "I read the DeLuca Holdings acquisition notes," she said. "Your divisional brief was circulated in our strategy meeting this week. Impressive work." She said it with the clean directness of a professional compliment that wasn't trying to be more than what it was. "Thank you," Ariana said. The woman moved on. 2 more conversations in the first 20 minutes. Both substantive, both about the work, both from people who had apparently read the divisional brief Lorenzo had distributed. The industry reception function of the event was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was create the professional context in which her presence here made complete sense. She accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She spoke to 3 people she recognized from the Meridian executive tier. She did not feel entirely comfortable, but she felt present, which was different, and she was beginning to understand more important. She saw Lorenzo across the room at 8:30. He was with a group of 4. 2 men she recognized from the board, a woman she didn't, someone from city government based on the conversation's body language. He was doing what he did in rooms like this, which was exist in them without performing existence. And she watched him for a moment from across the ballroom with the specific quality of attention she gave things that mattered to her when she was being honest about it. He hadn't looked up. Then he had. The way you sometimes knew you were being watched before you could identify from where. Their eyes met across the room. He didn't smile. She didn't either. They just held the look for a moment. The particular look of 2 people who had been through something together and were acknowledging that without needing to name it. And then someone said something to him, and he looked away, and she turned back to her own conversation. Her chest was doing something she was going to have to address later in private when she had the room for it. She found Elliot Ashcroft before he found her. That had been intentional. She had spent part of the afternoon thinking about the geometry of the room and the geometry of what he intended to do, and she had concluded that the worst version of the night was one in which he controlled the moment of confrontation. So when she spotted him at 8:47, standing near the bar with 2 men whose body language suggested legal counsel rather than social companions, she didn't wait. She crossed the room. She felt people noticing. That was fine. That was, in fact, the point. Elliot saw her coming at about 15 feet out, and something moved through his face. Surprise, then recalibration, then the particular mask of a man who had been in controlled confrontations his whole life and believed he knew how to manage them. She stopped 2 feet from him. The men with him stepped back slightly, the instinctive movement of people who understood they were about to be adjacent to something they hadn't signed up for. She looked at Elliot Ashcroft and said nothing for a moment, and she let him feel the full weight of that, of being looked at by the woman he'd destroyed steadily in a room full of his peers without flinching. "Ms. Vale," he said. His voice was controlled. His eyes weren't entirely. "The filing is public," she said. Her voice was quiet enough that it didn't carry past the 2 of them, which was a choice. This wasn't a performance for the room. This was between them. "You know that. Your attorneys are going to have a difficult year," she said. "The documentation is solid. The principal's testimony is on record. Damien's affidavit is on record." She paused. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm not here to make a scene or have you removed or do any of the things you expected me to do. I'm here because I wanted you to look at me." He looked at her. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Not for the case, not for any legal purpose, just as a fact." She kept her voice even, the way she'd kept it even in every room that had tried to make her feel small for a decade. "You took 11 years from me, not my career. I rebuilt that. Not my reputation. That's being rebuilt now. You took 11 years of my life that I spent being afraid of exactly this. Rooms like this one. People like these. She let him see all of it. Not the rage, not the tears, just the full, clear truth of it. Steady and irreversible. And I need you to know that I'm standing here anyway, in this room, in this dress, with my name on a building 4 blocks from here, and there's nothing you can do about that. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something she recognized. The particular expression of a man who had spent his life using power as a substitute for courage, and was now sitting across from someone who had found the real thing and knew the difference. The legal process will handle the rest, she said. But this moment is mine. She turned and walked away from him. She did not look back. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were entirely steady. Both of those things were true at the same time, and she let them be. She found a quiet corner near the far windows at 9:15, not hiding, just breathing. Below, the city ran its lights across the dark in the particular way of Chicago at night, dense and cold and indifferent, and hers in the specific way that a city became yours when you'd chosen it deliberately and survived in it. She heard him before she saw him. Ariana, Damien's voice, quiet, uncertain in a way she'd never heard his voice be, in the version of him she'd carried in her memory. But that version was 11 years old and had never been complete. She turned. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 4 days. There was something stripped away from him. The practiced ease that old money installed in people from birth, the automatic confidence of a man who had never needed to earn a room's respect because the room had pre-decided it. All of that was gone. What was left was just a person standing in front of someone he had hurt, without the insulation of not knowing it. "I'm not going to take your time," he said. I needed you to know that the affidavit wasn't—" He stopped, tried again. "I didn't do it for the case. I mean, I know it helps the case, but that's not why." She waited. "I did it because it was the only thing I had that was actually worth anything," he said, "after everything. And I needed to give you something real, even if it's the only thing I ever—" He stopped again. She looked at him. She thought about 24-year-old Ariana, who had loved this man with the uncomplicated faith of someone who hadn't yet learned the specific cost of that kind of faith. She thought about the note he'd left, the slightly leftward handwriting. "I didn't know, please." "Thank you for the affidavit," she said. He nodded. "Damien." She held his eyes. "I believe you didn't know." Something in his face collapsed and rebuilt itself in about 3 seconds. "That doesn't mean we go back to anything," she said. "Not cruel, not cold, just true. There's no version of this where we—" "I know," he said quickly. "I know. I don't expect anything. I just needed—" "I know what you needed," she said. They stood in the quiet for a moment. In the margins of a ballroom full of Chicago's financial world, 2 people on the other side of a decade of damage, and she felt something that she hadn't felt about this particular history since it had happened. Not peace exactly, but the specific release of a story that had been held in tension too long finally being allowed to find its shape. "Live better than he did," she said, meaning Elliot. He understood. He nodded once. He left. She turned back to the window. Her reflection was there in the dark glass. Navy dress, bare face, the city behind her rendered backward and luminous. She looked at it for a moment and then looked past it, out at the real thing. So, Lorenzo found her at 9:30. He didn't make a production of it. He simply appeared beside her at the window, close enough to be present, far enough to give her the air she was still settling back into. He stood next to her and looked out at the city and said nothing for a moment, which was one of the things about him she had come to value more than she'd expected. He knew when not to speak. "Elliot left 20 minutes ago," he said finally. "I know, I saw. His attorneys called mine at 9:10. They want to discuss terms." She looked at him. "Already?" "The public filing plus the room full of witnesses to whatever happened at that bar." "Yes, already." He paused. "Moore will handle it. You won't need to be involved in the negotiations unless you want to be." "I want to be." "I figured." She looked back out at the city. The lake was somewhere in the dark to the east, invisible from here, vast and cold and real. Graves resigned this afternoon, Lorenzo said. Submitted it to HR just before the event. I assume he saw the filing and made a calculation about which side of the situation he wanted to be on. Is that a problem? It's a vacancy, easier to fill now than it would have been. She nodded. How are you? He said. The question landed differently than it usually did from people. Not as social protocol, not as the prelude to advice, but as a real question from a person who wanted a real answer and had the patience to wait for it. She thought about how to answer it honestly. I'm standing here, she said. Yeah. That's more than I thought I'd be able to say 3 weeks ago. Just standing in a room like this and not counting the exits. She paused. It's a lot. Today has been a lot. It has. But I'm okay. She turned to look at him. I think I'm actually okay. He looked back at her with the specific quality of attention she'd been learning to hold. The kind that didn't ask for anything, didn't perform anything, just looked at what was there and saw it clearly. I know, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Why did you look at me in that room? The all hands. You looked at everyone and you stopped at me for 3 seconds and then you went looking. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking about how to answer it with the accuracy it deserved. Because you were the only person in that room who wasn't trying to be seen, he said. Everyone else was performing something. Fear, confidence, indifference. You were just there, doing the work of not being noticed and being so good at it that it looked like effort. He paused. I know what effort that takes. I've made that effort myself. For different reasons. But I recognized it. She thought about that. About what it meant to be recognized, not because you'd shown something, but because someone had seen the work of hiding it and known it from the inside. I didn't want to be found, she said. I know. I'm still not entirely sure what to do with being found. You don't have to know yet, he said. You've been doing that for about 3 weeks. Give it more than 3 weeks. She almost laughed. The thing in her chest that had been doing something she'd been carefully not naming did it again, warmer and less containable than before. The division is real, she said. Not a question, but a confirmation, an anchoring. It's real. And the work is what matters, not the rest of it. He looked at her carefully. The work is what matters. The rest of it is also real. He paused. Those two things can both be true. She held that. She had spent 10 years organizing her life around the principle that work was safe and everything else was exposure. The clean separation of the useful self from the self that could be hurt. It had been the architecture that kept her functional, and it had also been the architecture that kept her alone, and she had told herself those were the same thing, and they weren't. She knew they weren't. She looked back out at the city. I called my mother last week, she said. We talked for 7 minutes. Good. I'm going to call her again this weekend. Actually go see her. It's been... She stopped. It's been too long. Yeah. I've been letting it be too long because every time I thought about going back, it meant going back as who I'd become. The invisible version. And I didn't want them to see that. Didn't want them to know how far I'd... She stopped again, corrected the sentence. How much I'd hidden. They already knew, he said quietly. People who love someone always know. They just wait. She breathed. The ballroom behind them was still full of sound and light, and 200 people doing the business of existing at the intersection of money and ambition. And here at the window it was quiet, and the city outside was exactly what it had always been. Massive and indifferent, and full of the specific kind of possibility that only existed in places where enough people had lost enough things and kept going anyway. She thought about 10 years. She thought about a back corner desk and a gray cardigan and glasses she didn't need and a door she'd taken every day to avoid the elevator because the elevator made her feel trapped. She thought about a man who had looked at a room full of people performing their various versions of themselves and had stopped at the one person who was performing the absence of herself and had found the actual person underneath without asking permission, without warning, without ever once making her feel like the finding was something she should be ashamed of. She thought about her mother's voice. We're proud. All the ordinary catastrophe of love that she'd been too afraid to let near her for a decade, because love could be weaponized, love could be taken and used against you, love required the terrifying act of being known by someone who could leave. Some of them left. That was true. It would always be true. Some of them didn't. I should go back in, she said. There are 3 people I still need to speak to. I know, he said. Moore pointed them out. Of course she did. She turned from the window, straightened the line of her dress with her hands, a brief automatic gesture. The filing. The terms of the settlement, when Elliot's team comes to the table. We'll talk about it Monday. I want full public acknowledgement, not just a sealed settlement. I want the fabrication acknowledged in the public record. That'll be in the terms, he said. Non-negotiable. She nodded. She stepped away from the window. Then she stopped. Lorenzo. He looked at her. She held it for a moment, Mom. The thing she'd been not naming for 3 weeks. The thing that had been building in the specific, careful way of things that knew they needed to wait for the right moment and had been patient about it. You said you recognized something, she said. In me. The effort of hiding. Yes. What was yours? He was quiet for a moment. The city sat behind him in the window, luminous and backward. Bridgeport, he said. 19 years old. My father died owing debts to people who collected in the specific way that people without legal recourse collect. I spent 2 years being afraid of every room I walked into, counting exits, performing a version of myself that was functional enough to survive. He paused. I stopped being afraid by building something that made the fear irrelevant. That's a different solution than you found, and not necessarily the better one. He held her eyes. You survived by going quiet. I survived by going loud. We both paid for it. She held that. What did you pay? She said. 10 years of not trusting anything that didn't have a price I could calculate in advance, he said. Not trusting rooms, not trusting people. Until a back corner analyst refused a direct offer and I looked at why and found something I recognized and apparently decided that was more interesting than continuing to be careful. The thing she'd been not naming settled into the space between them, like something that had been waiting for them both to catch up to it. That's a terrible reason to upend someone's life, she said. Probably, he said. Are you complaining? She looked at him. No, she said. 6 months later, the settlement was public. The formal acknowledgement, drafted by Moore, reviewed by Ariana line by line, signed by Elliot Ashcroft's attorneys on a Tuesday morning in January, stated clearly, in language that left no room for misreading, that the materials distributed in 2014 were fabricated, that the campaign against Ariana Vale had been deliberately orchestrated, and that no basis existed for any allegation against her professional or personal reputation from that period. It ran in 3 financial publications by end of day. By the following morning, it had been picked up broadly. She read it at her desk, her new desk, in the new divisional offices on the 28th floor, a corner space with a view she'd initially thought was too much and had come to accept as simply what the work warranted. Her team of 6 was already in the adjoining open area, working. She could hear the specific ambient sound of people doing good work, the low conversation, the keyboard rhythm, the occasional sharp exchange of ideas that meant something real was being built. She forwarded the settlement notice to her mother with a single line. It's done. I'll come this weekend. Her mother responded in 4 minutes with a string of characters that Ariana suspected was an emoji her mother had not fully figured out how to use, and a sentence that said, Your father will cook. Don't bring anything. Just come. She set her phone down and looked out the window at Chicago in the specific clear light of a January morning, hard and bright and honest. The lake visible today, steel gray and enormous in the distance. The oversized cardigans were in a bag in the back of her closet, not thrown away. She wasn't sentimental about them, but she wasn't theatrical about discarding them either. They had been armor when she needed armor. The needing had changed. The cardigans could stay in the closet and mean nothing, which was the most complete form of moving past something she knew. The glasses had stayed on the bathroom counter until she'd thrown them away on a Wednesday, without ceremony, before she'd even fully registered doing it. She worked until noon, ate lunch at her actual desk, not hidden, not half a sandwich consumed without noticing, but a real meal that she tasted. She reviewed 2 reports from her team, made notes, sent feedback that was direct and specific, and based on the response times, apparently useful. At 2:30, Damian Ashcroft's name appeared in a brief item that one of her alerts picked up. A profile in a New York financial publication, the kind that ran on people ascending rather than descending. He had joined a small private equity firm. The piece was neutral, professional, made no reference to Chicago or the settlement. She read it once, closed the tab, and went back to work. The past was not gone. It didn't work that way, and she had stopped expecting it to. What was different was its gravity. The way it had once bent everything toward it, warped the shape of every room she entered and every decision she made, and now sat at a distance that was still real but was no longer pulling. You didn't heal from something like what had happened to her the way a wound healed, clean and closed. You integrated it, carried it as part of the material of who you were rather than as the weight that defined the ceiling of what you could become. The difference was everything. Lorenzo was at her door at 6:15, which was not unusual. They had developed, over 6 months, the specific rhythms of two people who worked in adjacent orbits and had stopped pretending the adjacency was purely professional without making any production of what it actually was. He appeared at her door. She appeared at his. They ate dinner when the workday bled late enough to make the question obvious. They walked sometimes along the lakefront in the early dark, in the specific companionable quiet of people who had stopped needing to fill silence. "Ready?" he said. She was pulling on her coat. "What's the reservation?" 7:30, the Italian place on Huron. The one where the owner argues with his chef every Saturday. "That's the one." She picked up her bag, turned off her desk lamp, stood for a moment in the low light of the empty office, the city outside the window going amber and dark in the way of early winter evenings. And she looked at the desk and the files and the view and the particular life that had assembled itself in the past 6 months from the pieces of the one that had been taken from her. Not the same life. Something better and harder and more real. Built from the wreckage of the other thing by someone who had finally stopped treating survival as the ceiling. Lorenzo was watching her. "What?" he said. "Nothing." She moved toward the door. "I was just nothing." He let her have it. That was one of the things she'd learned about him, over 6 months of learning things about him. He understood the difference between a person who needed to be asked and a person who needed to be allowed. He was good at reading which was which. They took the elevator down, which she did every day now without thinking about it. The lobby was busy, the end-of-day rush still moving through, the revolving door cycling people in and out in the specific rhythm of a city that never stopped. She walked through it, and the cold hit her face clean and sharp and honest. Chicago in January. She breathed it in. He was beside her. The city ran its lights out in all directions. North along the lake, west through the grid, south toward Bridgeport, where a 19-year-old had once learned what it cost to survive and had built an empire around making sure the cost was never that high again. East, the lake sat in the dark, enormous and unconcerned with any of it. She had walked into this city's financial world at 24 with the clean faith of someone who hadn't yet learned what rooms could do. She had walked back into it at 34 with something better than faith, with evidence. The evidence of her own survival, the evidence of work that held up under scrutiny, the evidence of a person who had been taken apart and had, piece by piece, chosen to put herself back together as herself, rather than as the smaller and safer version that fear would have preferred. Not perfect. Not unbroken, not past the moments when the weight of the decade still moved through her at odd angles and caught her off guard. But standing, always standing. Lorenzo's hand found hers in the cold, easy and unhurried, the way a thing happened when it had been waiting long enough to be simply true. She held it. They walked north into the city, into the January dark, into everything that was still ahead of them. The work, the cases, the rooms that would still sometimes cost something to stand in, the calls home on weekends, the team she was building, the slow, patient business of becoming familiar to herself again. She had spent 10 years disappearing. It had taken 3 weeks to be found. It had taken 6 months to understand that being found wasn't the end of anything. It was just where the real story finally started.